Prologue. It was a long time ago, before modern roads cut through the Appalachian forests. There was an ancient trail known only to locals. She was so old that she seemed to have been trampled upon by hundreds of generations. However, over time, people began to avoid it, telling stories of those who dared to step on it but never returned. Legend had it that the trail was cursed, and anyone who found themselves on it at dusk would forever remain in the arms of the forest. Chapter 1. Planning the Campaign. Jacob, Thomas, and Michael gathered at an old gas station in their small town. It was an ordinary hot August day, when the air was thick and heavy with humidity, and they wanted to find at least a little coolness. Jacob, the leader of their company, had been full of enthusiasm since the morning. "Guys, I have an idea." His eyes shone with excitement. "Let's go on that old trail, the one called the Trail of the Missing." Thomas and Michael looked at each other, clearly not thrilled with the idea. They have heard these stories. Although everyone knew that these were only legends, the very thought of going there was unsettling. "You're kidding, right?" said Thomas, raising his voice a little. "We know this place is strange. Not many people go there, and for a reason." Jacob smiled as if his friends had already given up. He never believed in mystical stories and considered all these to be children's fairy tales. More so, it's going to be an adventure. Just think, no one's been there for decades. We might be the first to walk this trail all the way. Michael, the quietest of them all, finally spoke up. "What if those stories are true? I've heard that people really did disappear." Jacob shook his head. "It's all fiction. I've done my research. It's all just exaggeration. But if you don't want to, we can stay home and be bored for another weekend." These words touched Thomas. He always tried not to look weak. He sighed and finally agreed, "Okay, let's try. But if anything, we'll be right back." Michael just nodded silently. Although he didn't want to go, he didn't want to stay away either. Chapter 2. First Steps on the Path. When they finally set out for the forest, the sun had already begun to sink below the horizon. The sky was colored in warm shades of red and orange, creating the illusion of calm before the night. But the forest they entered seemed completely different. The dense trees grew so densely that almost no light penetrated through their crowns, leaving the trail in twilight before true night fell. The path was narrow and overgrown. She looked as if no one had walked her for a long time. Tall grass and tree branches hung over her, occasionally brushing against the face of one of the boys. "Why is this place so overgrown?" asked Thomas, carefully looking around. "Maybe because no one has been here for years," Jacob replied with a smile. He was the only one who seemed relaxed. However, after a few minutes of walking, even Jacob began to notice something unusual. The birds that usually chirped fell silent. Even the wind seemed absent, not swaying the leaves. All nature around was frozen as before a storm. "It's kind of too quiet here," Michael said, breaking the silence. "I've never heard anything like it. The forest always has some sounds." Jacob listened and had to agree. Even he couldn't deny that this silence was unusual. Chapter 3. Strange Signs. As the trail led them deeper into the forest, they came across something that made them stop. An old backpack lay on the ground. It looked as if it had been there for years. The fabric was torn and the color had almost faded from nature. But worst of all, it looked freshly abandoned. No plants or moss to cover it, as it should have been after so many years. "Hey, this sure isn't normal," Thomas said, inspecting the backpack. "Whose could it be?" "Maybe someone lost it here a long time ago," Michael suggested, although he didn't believe it himself. Jacob bent down to get a closer look at the backpack, but as soon as he touched it, he felt a strange sensation. His hand seemed to lose sensitivity for a moment, and an image flashed through his mind. A dark figure standing between the trees and looking at them. He shuddered, but tried not to show it to the others. "Just old junk, I guess," Jacob said, trying to shake off the unpleasant feeling. But Michael did not give up. He began to examine the backpack more carefully and found several old things in it. A rusty flashlight, a broken compass, and a tattered map. The map was unusual in that it showed the path they were following, but further on it indicated several places marked with a red cross. "Are these places where people disappeared?" Michael asked in a whisper, showing the map to Jacob and Thomas. Their faces turned pale, but no one wanted to admit their fear. "Nothing special," Jacob shrugged, although inside he felt cold. "Let's move on." Chapter 4. Light in the Darkness. Darkness was quickly enveloping the forest, and now they were walking in almost full moon in the darkness, using only his flashlights, the light of which barely cut through the thick night. But something even more unusual happened here. In the distance they saw a faint light that wavered between the trees, as if floating in the air. "What could it be?" asked Thomas in a whisper, not taking his eyes off that strange light. "Perhaps other tourists?" said Michael, although he himself understood that it was unlikely. Jacob tried to remain confident, even though something inside him told him that they weren't human. The light moved too smoothly, as if it did not obey the laws of physics. "We have to check it out," he said, walking forward. The light seemed to be getting closer, but as they approached it, it receded each time. Chapter 5. Alluring Lights. The boys followed the light, although something in their hearts told them they were making a mistake. With each step they took, the light, which at first seemed so close, seemed to be amused by its play, receding farther and farther away. They should have turned back a long time ago, but something unknown was pulling them forward. The forest seemed to have a life of its own. The branches of the trees bent over their heads like hands trying to touch them. "Maybe enough?" Thomas finally said, his voice filled with anxiety that he could no longer hide. "We are already tired, and the flashlights are about to go out." "Just a little more, Thomas," Jacob insisted, though he himself felt an inner restlessness he hadn't known before. "We're almost there." Michael walked silently, his steps no longer as confident as at the beginning. He also felt that someone or something was watching them. With every step he took, he heard a slight rustling behind him, but every time he turned, he saw no one. This silence was more terrifying than any sounds that could have been there. The light was getting closer, but then they realized that they were lost. The path they were on disappeared as soon as they turned a corner. Now before them was only a dense forest and that strange light that again hissed between the trees. The boys' flashlights began to dim, leaving them in almost complete darkness. "We don't know where to go anymore," Michael said quietly, trying to hold back his panic. "The light does not lead us to the exit, but deeper into the forest. Maybe it's some kind of lighthouse, an old lantern?" Jacob assumed with hope, but he himself understood that this was a fiction. "We must go on. If we stop, we will be lost forever." But at that moment it became clear that the light was not a beacon and did not belong to people. It was something different, something old and alien. The fire stopped in the middle of the clearing, where they finally came out and began to spin around. There was something hypnotic about this strange dance of light, and the boys involuntarily began to approach it. "It's a trap," Michael whispered. "We have to get out of here." Chapter 6. Lost in the Dark. As soon as Michael said this, the light went out as if it had never existed. There was an absolute silence in the darkness that made all three of them stop in their tracks. The flashlights now gave almost no light, and the forest seemed to completely shut them in its possessions. "What now?" asked Thomas, gasping for air, trying to understand his own fear. "We have to go back. We'll get back on the trail and find our way home," Jacob said firmly, though he wasn't sure what he was saying. They turned and started to make their way through the thick undergrowth, but the forest didn't seem to let them go. The shadows that appeared at the edge of vision appeared more and more often. Their flashlights flickered and the boys began to hear the same rustling noise as before, but now it was closer, as if the shadows were chasing them. "We got lost," said Michael. "We're stuck here." Thomas looked around and caught sight of a dark figure standing among the trees. He screamed and stopped. "There's someone there." His voice cut through the silence, but when everyone turned in the same direction, there was nothing. "Don't be afraid. It's your imagination." Jacob tried to reassure him, but he himself felt that something was wrong. "We will find a way," but there was no way back. The forest around them changed. Now, instead of ordinary trees, there were rotten trunks covered with moss and mushrooms. The faint light of the moon seeped through the clouds, and they realized that they had followed the wrong path by which they had come. Chapter 7: Whispers and Shadows. The further they went, the more the forest changed. The shadows between the trees began to move independently of the flashlights. They saw something dark flicker in the periphery of their vision, disappear behind the trees, only to reappear further down the road. "I can't take it anymore." Michael stopped and grabbed Jacob's hand. "We must find our way back or we are lost." Jacob felt fear too, but he couldn't show it to his friends. He looked around the forest and realized that they were really lost. "But we have to move. Standing here is definitely death," he insisted. The boys continued to make their way through the thickets, but their surroundings became less and less recognizable. It seemed that the forest had a life of its own, constantly changing its appearance. They were haunted by whispers, as if someone was telling them something incomprehensible, ominous. "Do you hear that?" Thomas asked, listening to voices coming from all directions. "It's not just the wind. It's the wind," Jacob tried to say, but even he couldn't believe his words. The whispers grew louder. He was everywhere. In the air, in the trees, even under their feet. "No, it's not the wind," insisted Michael. "Something is telling us. The forest wants us to stay." Chapter 8: Voices from the Past. The whisper was not just a sound, it was real words spoken in a whisper, but in such a way that it was impossible to understand their meaning. The voices sounded familiar and unsettling at the same time, as if they were memories that belonged to them but that they were trying to forget. "We have to find that backpack," Thomas said suddenly, full of new hope. "Maybe there's something else there that will help us get out. Maybe a map or a note." They walked back down the same trail trying to find the backpack. And, amazingly, after a few minutes of wandering, they came upon him again, as if the backpack had found them on its own. This time, as Jacob bent down to pick him up, he felt a different touch, one as cold as ice, running through his body. They opened the backpack again and found a few more things, including an old diary. It was handwritten, but the pages were too damaged to be fully read. Only a few sentences on one of the pages could be deciphered. "We are not alone. The forest is taking. Run away." Chapter 9: The End of the Road. Reading the words from the old diary, Jacob, Thomas, and Michael finally realized that they were trapped in this ominous forest. The feeling of an invisible presence became stronger and stronger. The forest breathed with them, absorbing their fear. Now every rustling of leaves, every rustling behind was perceived as a threat. They heard the same voices again, but now they were clearer. "We are not alone. We see you." Thomas clutched the journal to his chest as if it might protect him from what was coming. "We have to find a way back," he said in a trembling voice. "We can't stay here overnight. There's no way out here," Michael whispered, looking straight ahead into the darkness. He had felt it for a long time, but only now admitted it out loud. "We're lost. Forever." Jacob felt a cold sweat run down his back. He was always a leader, always believed that he could find a solution to any problem. But now, for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. The forest seemed endless, as if they were stuck in a time loop that kept spinning them in the same place. "We can't just give up," he said, trying to keep control. "We have to stay together and keep moving. Our only hope is to find a way out." Michael caught him by the shoulder and held him close. "You don't understand. This place isn't just a forest. It's a trap. We're trapped. And the more we try to escape, the deeper we get lost." Jacob pulled away from Michael, not wanting to hear those words. He could not accept such a defeat. Not now, when they were so close to breaking the old legend. But panic was growing inside him. Chapter 10: The First Victims. Their condition was getting worse. For more than an hour they wandered among the trees, but each time they returned to the same place. The forest seemed to play with them, forcing them to turn back as if mocking them. Michael was walking last in the group, trying to keep up, when suddenly he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around, sure that someone was there. "But I didn't see anything." "What are you doing?" Thomas asked when he noticed that Michael was lagging behind. I heard footsteps behind me," Michael said, breathing heavily. "Someone is following us." "You're out of your mind," Jacob said, though he wasn't sure what he was saying. His own fear was slowly taking over him, but he still tried to hang on. "There's nobody here," but the footsteps continued, and now everyone could hear them. They were heavy, measured steps that came closer and closer. The boys sped up, trying to escape, but the steps kept up. "Rather!" Thomas shouted, and they ran. They panicked. The flashlights were shaking in their hands, and every step they took seemed like their last. At last they came out into a small clearing. The footsteps stopped, but now they faced an even greater threat. In the center of the clearing stood an old wooden cross on which something was written in ancient letters. They ran closer and read the inscription. "Staying here forever." Michael began to gasp in panic. His hands were shaking and his legs were barely holding him in place. This can't be true," he whispered, looking at the cross as if it were a sentence. "We can't stay here." "But it seems we have no choice," Thomas said, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He could no longer contain his fear. Under the cross, among the roots, something was moving. It slowly emerged from the ground, and in the light of the flashlight, the boys saw a human hand. The bodies were not visible under the ground, but the hand looked as if it was trying to pull them into the depths. The boys took a few steps back in disbelief with your eyes. "We must run," Jacob shouted, but as soon as they took a few steps back, the shadows of the trees began to move towards them. The shadows that had previously been only faint outlines were now clear, and they weren't just watching, they were advancing. Chapter 11: The Forest Awakens. The forest began to act openly. The darkness grew thicker every minute, turning into a material threat. Shadows moved between the trees, approaching the boys. The cold wind, which was only a light breeze before, turned into a piercing, whistling roar. The branches of the trees swayed as if with hands, trying to grab them. Michael panicked, dropping his flashlight on the ground and running straight into the woods. His cry cut through the silence. "Michael, no!" Jacob shouted, trying to stop him, but it was too late. Michael disappeared into the darkness, his scream drowned out by the noise of the forest. Thomas and Jacob were left alone. "We can't leave him," Thomas said, feeling his legs refuse to go. "We can't follow him," Jacob answered sharply. "It's a trap. He's already—" But he could not finish the sentence, because suddenly he felt something grab his leg. A dark shadow came out of the ground and dragged him down. He managed to shout, but after a few seconds his face disappeared underground. Thomas, scared to death, retreated in horror. His body was shaking, he couldn't control his fear. All their fears, all legends turned out to be true. Chapter 12: eternal captivity. Thomas could feel something extremely dark and ancient approaching him, filling every corner of the forest, consuming his will and strength to resist. He understood that this was not just a place, the forest had a consciousness of its own. It was a place where time lost its meaning, and those who got lost here remained a part of it forever. The whispers did not stop. They mingled with the sound of the wind. The forest seemed to laugh at his fear. "You will not escape. We will take you." Thomas looked around, trying to find some way back. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his fingers were numb from the cold. The flashlight, the only thing that gave him at least some confidence, flickered and threatened to go out for good. He moved forward, not knowing where he was going. His brain was filled with panic. He ran a few meters through the thick undergrowth, turning constantly, trying to keep his eye on every shadowy movement. However, the forest seemed to change with him, the trees growing thicker, as if creating a wall that could not be overcome. The darkness was so thick that even the light of a lantern could not penetrate it. Everything around Thomas turned into an endless sea of black shadows. He realized that he was no longer walking on ordinary ground. His feet were sinking into some invisible quagmire, which was dragging him deeper and deeper. Suddenly his flashlight went out completely. The darkness became absolute. Thomas could no longer see even his hands in front of his face. He stopped, stunned by the silence that fell upon him. Every sound, rustle of leaves, crunch of branches, silence. The feeling of being watched became unbearable. He could feel something creeping up behind him, but he couldn't turn back. Suddenly, from the depths of the darkness, Thomas heard muffled voices. They were quiet and distant, as if coming from another world, but at the same time they seemed terribly close. "Thomas! Thomas!" His name sounded as if he was being called from the other side of the darkness. The boy froze. He was chilled to the bone. It was the same feeling he had felt before, but now it was immediate and all-consuming. The voices sounded like they belonged to Jacob and Michael. "Thomas, come to us. We are here. We have found a way." "No," he whispered, stepping back even though he couldn't see anything. He knew it was a lie. These were not his friends. It was the same voices they had heard before, the ones that had lured them into a trap. "We found a way out. Thomas, we're waiting for you." "It's a trap," he shouted, although his voice sounded hoarse and quiet, as if the forest itself was strangling him with its own hands. The whispers became louder and more insistent, as if they were surrounding him from all sides, preventing him from escaping. He spun around, trying to make out something in the darkness, but he couldn't see anything, only a presence. "Stay with us. Stay. The forest is your home now." Thomas understood that this was the end. He couldn't run anymore. The forest wouldn't let him out. The body became heavy. The legs no longer obeyed. Now he could hear not only whispering, but also breathing behind him, heavy and cold, which enveloped him, absorbing the last strength. And then he saw them. Two figures appeared in the darkness, Jacob and Michael. Their faces were pale and lifeless, and their eyes black as the abyss. They did not walk, but seemed to float in the air, approaching him. Their lips moved as they uttered the same words. "Join us, Thomas. We're all here." Thomas wanted to run, but his legs refused to move. He stood, chained to the spot, unable even to scream. His body froze in terror. The figures of his friends moved closer, arms outstretched, and when they touched him, everything became a black void. The forest swallowed him. Chapter 13. Ancient Evil. Thomas could no longer feel his body. He was part of something bigger, something older than this forest, than anything he had ever known. His consciousness wandered in the darkness, where time and space did not exist. He saw images, fragments of the past, felt the fear and pain of those who came here before. This place was not just a forest. It was a trap created by an ancient evil that fed on human souls, dragging them into eternal darkness. Thomas realized that he was just another victim who became part of this cycle. The forest collected them all like trophies, turning them into shadows guarding its borders. He felt the presence of others, those who had once also wandered through this forest. Their souls were imprisoned here, forever doomed to be a part of this place. Whispers no longer scared him. Now he was one of them. He became part of this darkness, this ancient evil. His consciousness was now mixed with the others, and he no longer had a body, only the memory of who he was. But those who remained alive continued to wander. The forest remained in place, waiting for new victims. And when the next group re-enters his shadow, Thomas and the other shadows will be ready to meet them. Chapter 14. The End with No Way Out. Morning never came in this forest. The darkness remained here forever, engulfing all who dared to enter. Now this place was home to Jacob, Michael, Thomas, and many others whose fates were intertwined in this terrible place. Everyone who got here became a part of the forest, its dark heart. The shadows continued to live, haunting each new guest, hoping on their fear, on their weakness. And when the next daredevils come again to prove their bravery or solve the mysteries of this place, the forest will open its trap again. The history of the forest continued. Chapter 15. The New Group. A few months later, a group of 5 young people went to the same forest in which Jacob, Michael, and Thomas disappeared. It was a team consisting of Anna, Ben, Sarah, Oliver, and Kate. They had heard rumors about the forest and were determined to prove that all these stories were just fiction. They packed their backpacks, took cameras and flashlights with them, heading into the unknown, not knowing what evil awaited them. "It will be a great adventure," Anna exclaimed, and her voice was so cheerful that it dispelled the fear in the hearts of the others for a moment. "Just remember we have to be careful," Ben said, trying to distract himself from the shadow that was lurking in his soul. "Don't be fooled by these mythical legends." Kate looked at the forest, its trunks reminding her of huge black monoliths sticking out of the ground. She felt a chill run down her back, but she tried not to show her fear. All were too sure of their determination to admit what frightened them. The group moved deeper into the forest, laughing and chattering. But the deeper they went, the less their speech sounded. The forest grew quieter and quieter, and with every step they took they felt something was watching them. Chapter 16. The First Signs. A few hours passed and the group stopped for lunch. They sat down on a small lawn surrounded by trees and began to have a snack. Oliver, always the most humorous, tried to lighten the mood. "Imagine if we really find something supernatural," he said with a smile. "Maybe we will even meet a spirit?" "Let the spirits stay where they belong," Sarah replied grimly, her voice slightly worried. She looked around, feeling the forest clutching them in its arms. "You don't believe in all these stories, do you?" Ben asked with a dismissive shrug. But as soon as they returned to their meal, the air suddenly grew colder, and a soft rustling came from the darkness. The group fell silent. They all stopped and listened. "Did you hear that?" Kate whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's just the wind," Oliver said, but his confidence was gone. For a moment it seemed to them that someone was standing behind the trees and watching them. "Let's go back," Anna said suddenly, her voice sounding like fear was brewing inside her. But they could not return. The forest seemed to close in around them, leaving no way back. Chapter 17. The darkness has thickened. They set out again deep into the forest, but now the anxiety did not leave them. Every time they heard invisible sounds, The fear became more and more severe. The darkness thickened. The trees became like merciless ex-guards, ready to attack at any moment. They didn't laugh anymore. There was only horror in their eyes. "We need to find a place to spend the night," Ben said as night fell. "Don't wander in the dark." The group came across an old, abandoned campsite. The wooden houses were covered with moss and looked as if they had been abandoned decades ago. They decided to stay here for the night, hoping that this old structure would protect them. But the nights in the forest were different. As soon as it got dark, the forest came alive. The noise mingled with the shadows, as if the spirits of the forest were marking their arrival. Chapter 18: The First Victims. In the middle of the night, Oliver awoke to whispers. He turned to see the others sleeping, but the sounds were getting louder and louder. Something appeared in his mind, thoughts of darkness, of someone or something waiting. Oliver decided to go outside to see if it was just his imagination. As soon as he came out, a cold wind wrapped around him like an old hand reminding of something forgotten. He looked around, but the forest only hummed, as if alive, ready to receive him. Suddenly, a figure appeared out of the darkness. She was unclear, seemed shocked and powerless. Oliver couldn't make out who it was, but his heart beat faster. The figure slowly approached, words flying from her lips. "Help!" Oliver shouted, his voice echoing through the forest, waking the rest. They jumped out of the house to find him, only to see shadows. "Oliver!" Anna called, but she was not answered. There was no one. "He was here. I saw him," Ben shouted, his voice hoarse with fear. But Oliver disappeared. The forest closed in around them again. Chapter 19: The Forest is Watching. The next morning, the group searched for Oliver, but the forest became even more unfamiliar. They could not find their way back, and even finding his tracks was difficult. Time seemed to cease to exist, and the forest mocked them, causing uncertainty. "We need to split up," Kate suggested, trying to reassure her friends. "Maybe one of us will find him." "That's a bad idea," Ben said. "We cannot leave each other." But Anna decided, "We will not achieve anything if we do not try. I'll go with you, Kate." And they left, leaving Ben and Sarah together. The shadows growing around them looked more and more menacing. Chapter 20: Wretched Souls. Kate and Anna walked deeper into the forest, hoping to find any traces of Oliver. But the further they went, the more they felt that this place wanted to swallow them. They heard voices, but this time they sounded like moans. "It's scary," Anna whispered, pausing to look around. "Don't stop," Kate urged. "We must continue. Oliver may be close." But the forest was expanding and their faith was diminishing. They saw old, moss-covered plaques that indicated that others had once lived here. "Stay away before it's too late." And then they understood this forest not only protected themselves from them, but also gathered all who came, turning them into a part of its terrible history. Chapter 21: An Unexpected Discovery. Meanwhile, Ben and Sarah stayed put, hoping their friends would return. But each time the darkness deepened, they felt something change. "Do you think Oliver is all right?" Sarah asked, feeling anxious. "I don't know," Ben said, looking around. "But I can't stay here. I'm going to look for them." He began his search, but quickly realized that the forest had become even more impenetrable. He could hear distant whispers filling his ears. Something dark, big and terrible was watching him. He came across an old abandoned hut. There was a strange atmosphere inside. He didn't know why, but something inside him was drawn to him. But when he entered, what he saw horrified him. On the walls were paintings, ancient images of people who had gone into the forest and never returned. He understood that there were not just victims here. There were those who became part of the forest. Chapter 22. Solving the Mystery. Ben turned to Sarah, trying to explain to her what had happened in the cabin. They decided they needed to find their friends, but when they started looking, they felt something strange again. They came to a place where the forest seemed to begin to circle, casting shadows. Suddenly, Ben heard a moan that sounded extremely close. He stopped and said to Sarah, "Did you hear that? Could have been Oliver." They rushed toward the sound, but each time they got closer, it disappeared, as if the forest was sucking up their every step. "This isn't just a forest," Sarah whispered, realizing what was really happening. "This is a trap." Chapter 23. Shadows of the Past. Anna and Kate, still searching for Oliver, stumbled upon a dark circle. The trees here stood as if they formed a wall, their branches intertwined, and the light did not pass inside. They felt the presence. "That's strange," Kate said. "I feel that something is wrong here," and turned around and saw a figure standing in the center of the circle. She was very similar to what they were looking for. "Oliver," she urged. The figure returned to them. It wasn't Oliver, but it was a man filled with terror and helplessness. "Run," she whispered. "It's dangerous here." But before they could figure out what to do, the shadows around them began to move. The forest began to feel their presence, and it spewed out its guards. Chapter 24. Fleeing into the unknown. Anna and Kate were scared. They started to run, but the forest was getting thicker and thicker. The noise grew louder, and something threatened to overtake them. "We can't stop," Anna called, but at some point Kate tripped and they fell. The forest seemed to stop as it watched them struggle to stand. When they finally got up, dark figures appeared around them. They were the souls of those who disappeared, and now they became part of this forest. "Help us," they whispered, extending their hands to the girls. Chapter 25. The Last Stand. Anna and Kate knew this was the end, but they still had one hope. They knew they couldn't let the forest take them away. "We must fight," Anna exclaimed, leaning into Kate. Remembering the old hut, they decided to return. If this is truly a place that gathers souls, maybe they can find a way to break free. The struggle was difficult. The forest seemed to grow stronger in its attempt to stop them. But the girls could not give up. They found the cabin and began to investigate, trying to find ways to stop this ancient evil. With effort, they found an old diary that described how the forest collected souls, how they became a part of it. But the diary also spoke of a way of liberation, a ritual that required courage and faith. Their hearts beat in unison. They knew this was their only chance. And now that the darkness was returning to them, they were ready to fight for their lives. This story continues. They must understand the secrets of the forest, overcome their fears, and perhaps find a way to free not only themselves, but also everyone else who has fallen victim to this ancient evil.